Dr. Paul Evans had a large practice that he started from the ground up, and he was well respected by his peers. Dr. Evans wasn't much for socializing. His neighbors would describe him as quiet and someone who kept to himself. When Dr. Evans did socialize, he had a wide and varied social standing. He attended benefits with pastors and millionaires, businessmen and social workers, many of whom had previously been patients of Dr. Evans. When Paul was a little boy, he became interested in human behavior. He loved to sit in a park and watch the people around him. He'd see their body language, watch their eyes fade when the person they'd been speaking with walked away. The way they'd tilt their head or look down. He saw them picking at their fingernails or flinching when someone touched them. He knew early on that people had secrets, and he wanted to know how to get the key to opening them up and knowing those secrets. Paul became a psychiatrist. He relished in hearing their deepest thoughts. He was drawn to hearing those darkest secrets, and he hated some of them. Their weakness, their whining insecurities, their whimpering before him, their lack of personal responsibility, their feeling of superiority. The pastor who fancied women of ill repute and beat them blamed it on his mother. The women of ill repute who had been beaten and tortured by that same pastor. The senator who beats his wife and he blames her for it. The car salesman who writes up an extra 10% to pocket for himself because he deserves it. The doctor who tells his patients that they need a surgery that they don't and prescribes medication they don't need because the drug companies pay him to. And now he's facing a lawsuit because the patient was selfish. The congressman scared that the truth will come out about the woman who wasn't his wife, that he got pregnant, and his career will be over. The woman who gave up her child to save a congressman's career. As most psychiatrists do, he had had some patients die by their own hand. It was unfortunate, he'd say to their relatives. But on the morning of January 19th, 2 police detectives arrived at Dr. Evans' office in regards to a local pastor who had been secretly hospitalized twice under the guise of exhaustion. But instead, it had been at the bequest of Dr. Evans, and his stay had been 2 mandatory 72-hour watches because, according to the doctor, the pastor had become despondent in recent weeks. The pastor had been found deceased in his home that very morning, and the police were wanting to question Dr. Evans about his patient's state of mind. What had made him so despondent, and also had some questions about his practice. Dr. Evans invited the detectives in and was receptive to their questions. The officers noted, though, that his demeanor was calm, almost cold in his responses. He seemed to have very little feelings about his patient having passed away so violently. When asked about the pastor's state of mind, the doctor simply replied, "Who's to really know the inner workings of a man's mind? Perhaps he could no longer bear what lurked behind his every thought." The officers noted that the answer to the question was quite odd, considering one would assume that the doctor might very well know what lurked behind his every thought, especially considering that it had been the doctor whom had had the pastor admitted to the hospital. But when pressed, the doctor assured them that the pastor had only been seeing him because of some sleep issues, and that his insomnia had caused him to become erratic and despondent. It was as simple as that, he was quoted as saying. The detectives began to question the doctor about some of his other patients who had died at their hands. One, Joe Parkins, who had been a construction worker, seemingly fine one day and gone the next. Dr. Evans explained that Mr. Parkins had lived through some childhood trauma that he'd recently begun to remember, and quite quickly became very depressed, when in fact Dr. Evans knew that Joe Parker's childhood trauma was that Joe Parker had once kidnapped a woman and starved her to death. And the detectives went on. Janet Bale. Dr. Evans explained that Janet had been contemplating her death for quite some time, probably born with the inclination for depression, and he had managed to keep her from it until one fateful evening, and he considered that a great tragedy, when in fact Mrs. Bale, while being depressed for certain, had no such inklings until she came to Dr. Evans at the bequest of her husband. He believed that she was possibly poisoning him, and she had been, and she felt little to no remorse at all. Actually, she was a cold-blooded killer, whom Dr. Evans had had to work at for quite a long time to get her to consider ending her own life. Yes, I said that. He worked on her for quite some time. See, Dr. Evans, the wildly respected and trusted doctor, actually had quite a high rate, when compared to other doctors in his field of expertise, of losing patients to traumatic events, each and every one a beautiful conquest in which he prided himself. Not every one is fit to live, he would think. Some should be eradicated. Some cannot be helped, their sickness too extreme or unfit for society. Dr. Evans considered himself at once undoing what never should have been done, and also relishing in his ability to change their mannerisms, to see the light in their eyes extinguish, to watch their heads go from proud little monsters to humiliated tiny animals. The detectives left, feeling a little uneasy, but unable to pinpoint exactly why. And then the senator came in for his appointment.